All right, if you are a home studio owner and you're mixing within a DAW in the modern era and you are obsessing about gain staging, reading all of these different conflicting opinions in online forums and Facebook groups and on YouTube, and you're thinking that understanding gain staging is going to somehow improve the sound of your mixes and recordings, I've got news for you. You're wasting your time. Let's dive into it. All right, so I've been running this YouTube channel for a few years now, and I constantly get comments on my mixing tutorials where people are obsessing about my levels being really low within my DAW. And I've come to realize that many of us, specifically home studio owners that are mixing within a DAW, are worrying so much about gain staging, and they're led to believe that gain staging is this magical thing that's gonna improve the sound of your productions and mixes. Well, it's not, and that's exactly what you're gonna learn in this video. I also want to say that I produced professionally for well over a decade before I even heard of the term gain staging, or at least gain staging in the sense that people are obsessing over, like I just mentioned, like levels being quiet or levels being hot within a DAW. Again, for me, I only had one simple rule of thumb when it came to gain staging, which I'm gonna talk about later in this video. And that's all I ever thought about. It never entered my mind. And again, this wasn't even brought to my attention until I started reading YouTube comments on my videos. Now, after this was brought to my attention, emails and YouTube comments, I've decided to do a little bit of digging to see where this myth and where this obsession actually comes from. And what I've come to realize is this theory and this idea comes from the analog domain. Here's the thing, gain staging in the analog world, meaning when you're using an analog console, tape machines, outboard gear, is extremely important. You have to know what you're doing. You have to pay attention to levels. And that's because in the analog domain, you are fighting against noise. That's right, when you record onto tape, you have a high noise floor. All analog circuitry and gear introduces some form of noise, which you have to keep in mind if you want your recordings to sound clean. But here's the thing, most of us are not working in the analog domain. I don't, and you probably don't. We're recording into our interfaces, we're mixing in our DAWs with plugins. So this idea and this obsession with numbers and gain staging makes 0% sense when you're working in the way I just mentioned. Again, in a DAW with plugins recording straight into an interface. And the reason for this is pretty simple. The noise floor is extremely low in a DAW, especially if you're recording at 24-bit, which 99.9% of us are recording at these days. Even if you're recording at 16-bit, that's still a wider dynamic range than when you record onto a tape machine, which almost no one does these days, especially home studio owners. So again, I just want to drive this point home. If you are like me and you are recording straight into a USB interface and you're mixing in your DAW, only using plugins, and you're thinking, oh, should I peak at -18, -6, -20? Oh my God, my levels are too hot. Oh my God, my levels are too quiet. You are wasting your time and you only really have to focus on one thing. Now, on the topic of that one thing, let's dive into one of my actual mixes and I'm going to reveal to you my approach to gain staging. And I think you're going to be flabbergasted by how dead simple it actually is. And hopefully it'll help save you time so you can focus on things that actually matter and that'll actually make your mixes better in the real world. All right, so here I am. I'm inside of my DAW. Now, before I dive into this mix, I want to talk a little bit about gain staging and tracking. And this is where I do see people making a common mistake. And what I often see, especially when clients will send me projects to mix that maybe they recorded out of their home studio, is people will clip their tracks on the way in, meaning they will clip their interface while recording guitars because they're not listening to the plain DI, they're listening to their guitars through their AmpSim plugins. And they're not paying attention to the waveform or their input signal. Now this is really bad because you cannot undo a clipped waveform that was clipped digitally. So what I always recommend as far as gain staging is concerned is to record conservatively as far as your input volume. Now, no, you should not be recording extremely quietly because yes, you can maybe end up in the noise floor, but most importantly, you're gonna make more work for yourself down the road because you're gonna have to boost your DI signal or your recording signal in the mix at the clip level. It's just more work than what's necessary. Now, on this topic that's related to tracking, people will then overthink their levels on the way in. And here's my simple rule of thumb that I mentioned earlier in the video. Just don't clip. I don't pay attention to exact numbers. It's unnecessary in the digital domain, especially when you're recording straight into a USB interface or any other piece of modern gear. My levels will often be between, I don't know, -8, -6, -12, -10. It really doesn't matter. And the most important thing to remember is do not clip on the way in when you're recording. It's better to record too quietly than clipping. And spoiler alert, the same thing goes for the mixing process in your DAW. Now I have a mix pulled up here and I'm gonna break down some of my levels because I've had people on YouTube critique this exact mix that I'm about to share with you, saying my levels are too quiet. They're asking me what's going on. How do you have a mix that sounds like that when your sub mixes are so quiet? We're gonna find out. Let's take a listen. Okay, so if you look here, I have my drum submix and my guitar submix. Pay close attention to the numbers, the average peak level of where the peaks are happening. So the exact numbers don't really matter. They're below -22, and that's what really freaks people out for some reason. But here's the thing. If you're mixing at 24-bit, you have 144 dB of dynamic range to play with. In other words, it's a non-issue. Where you set your levels doesn't really matter as long as you're not clipping any of your plugins. It is that simple. I promise you. Now, if you look at the level that's happening inside of my plugins on my master bus chain, my level's probably gonna be somewhere around -18 or -16, because that's where I like to have my mix level sitting before my mastering chain. So right here in this EQ, let's take a close look at the approximate or average level of my mix itself. Around -18 dB, which just so happens to be 0 dB analog. And guess what? This doesn't even matter. It is completely arbitrary. I don't know what it is, man. Online, people think that if you hit a certain level in your DAW, your mix is gonna be better. It's a complete myth. So if we look at my individual tracks, like let's go to, I don't know, my kick and snare drums. So my kick is at around -14 dB and my snare is actually close to 0. But it's not clipping. In modern DAWs, even if you clip on a per track basis, it doesn't matter. It's if you clip your output that matters. So again, I just want to reiterate this point. I pay attention to one thing while I'm recording and mixing, and that is to avoid clipping at all costs. Now, I'm conservative. I prefer not to clip anywhere, whether it's inside a plugin or on a track. I just avoid it altogether. Better safe than sorry. But I don't pay attention to, oh wait, I'm peaking at -22 here, and I need to hit this plugin at -3 dB and this plugin at -18 dB. This myth is way overblown and completely unnecessary, and it's probably wasting a lot of your time. Now, I know I hear it right now. I'm gonna get comments in the comment section asking about analog emulation plugins. And my good friend Jordan Valeriat, I've heard him talk about this, and he brings up an excellent logical point. Plugin manufacturers are not dumb. They are not going to design their plugins to sound bad when they're being used in the way that most modern in-the-box mixers are going to use them. In other words, they're not going to sound significantly better if you're hitting them at some sweet spot. I know some people believe this. I've been mixing in the box for close to 20 years now, and this is something I did not even think about until people would comment about it on my YouTube videos. It does not matter what levels your tracks are at as long as you have your relative balance set appropriately. So again, if you're freaking out about gain staging and you're really confused by it, don't be confused. Just make sure you're not clipping. And from here on out, focus on things that actually matter, like your songwriting, arranging, tracking, a basic understanding of EQ, compression, balance, all that good stuff. The truth is, so many home studio owners don't make progress because they focus on the wrong things, and I really don't want this for you. I want you to produce better results with the gear you're already using. And because of this, I'm making my polished production checklist PDF guide absolutely free right now. It's a simple, straightforward guide that outlines my typical workflow for an entire production. Download it, read it over, and get right to focusing on the things that'll make a real difference with your music. You could have direct access by clicking the link below in this video's description. So I'm curious to know, is gain staging something that you've been freaking out about? Have you been super confused about all of the conflicting opinions on the internet on this topic? If so, I would love to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below this video and tell me what you've been up to in your home studio. And until next time, happy mixing.